Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of Brotherless Night.
And I'm Jennifer Maritza McCauley, author of Neon Steel. Sugi, did you watch any of the Winter Olympics?
Oh my God, I love watching the Winter Olympics. And the U.S. women's hockey team dominated. The internet is still going crazy over that figure skater, Alyssa Liu.
Yeah, it was really great to see a lot of attention paid to women's categories. I didn't see a lot of people talking about it, but the women's freestyle skiing competition made history with the Winter Olympics' first ever openly transgender athlete competing in it.
Oh wow, really? I haven't actually heard anyone talking about that. That's incredible.
Yeah, the only issue is that his name is Ellis Lonholm, and he's a trans man who's considered ineligible to compete in the men's competition.
Okay. I guess I'm happy that he got to compete, but that feeling is more bittersweet than it was a few seconds ago. There are so many hoops transgender athletes have to jump through in order to compete. And luckily, today we have someone with us who knows a lot about the struggles trans athletes face.
Ellie Roscher is the author of Remarkable Rose, The Embodied Path, 12 Tiny Things, Play Like a Girl, and How Coffee Saved My Life. Ellie also founded and facilitates Plum Writing and Wellness, a supportive online community for folks journeying toward deeper embodiment together. She currently teaches writing and yoga in Minneapolis, though today she's here to discuss her most recent book, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. Welcome to the show, Ellie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
It's a treat to have you with us. And your book, which came out in January, is all about the current state and the hopeful future of trans athletes in sports. And Jennifer and I were just discussing how this Winter Olympics made history with the first ever trans athlete. But he had to compete in the women's skiing events instead of the men's. So is this progress? As you write in the book, the Olympic and Paralympic Games have had a policy on trans athlete participation since 2003. And between then and 2021, about 540,000 athletes have competed in the Summer Olympic Games, and none were trans in that period. And in 2021, two openly trans women competed, BMX alternate Chelsea Wolfe, who's from the US, and weightlifter Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand, neither of whom came even close to medaling, which is information you kind of put in the book as to counter the myth that trans athletes are coming in and quote unquote like stealing victories. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the situation for trans athletes in elite competitions like the Olympics going forward?
Yeah. So what you just stated kind of it addresses the first two sections of the myth that they're coming in droves in order to steal your medals. And it's just really important right now that when we're writing smart policy, we're writing policy that is dealing with reality. And the disproportionality is really noteworthy, that there's so many more bands of trans athletes than there is even out trans athletes, and that they're not winning. And so it really has become a solution in search of a problem, and it's a problem that we're not seeing in reality. I do want to talk about the Olympics first, in the fact that I think our bodies are really beautiful and complex. And sports are really beautiful and complex. And so I want to have a really beautiful and complex conversation about trans athletes in sport. And so anytime I see kind of a blanket ban that all trans athletes should be banned from participation, regardless of their sex, their category, their age, their sport, how high the stakes are, I get really curious about that, because I do think for us to move forward from this place, we're going to have a variety of policies that speak to a variety of realities. So when we're talking about the Olympics, we're talking about elite athletes, and that can be a different conversation than we're having about kids, about youth, about recreational athletes, right? And so one of the things is just like, yes, let's talk about the Olympics. And in this particular story, it pulls to mind a story of Dew, who gets highlighted in the book, where he is a trans boy who wants to compete in the boys category, but he's living in a state where he has to compete in the female category and he's winning. He's winning the girls category and he doesn't want to be. And so we have to really have conversations about what the sport is and who the athlete is and how we're going to be setting up the most people for success. And I think our conversation about the Olympics is really, really important because the decisions folks are making at that high level does kind of trickle down into how we think about and how we write policy when the stakes are a little bit lower. I do also want to pull up the story we highlight in 1992, the Barcelona Games, where clay pigeon shooting used to be a mixed sport, and then a woman won. And then right after that, it got broken up into sex segregated categories. And so we often say that we're banning trans athletes to protect women, but really we have a handful of stories where we're banning trans athletes and we're sex segregating in a way that is actually protecting the men too. So just getting clear about what's really, really happening. There's different types of strength and there's different types of bodies and there's different sports that highlight different types of strength, right? And so it's a really, really nuanced conversation. And right now we're seeing everywhere that trans athletes are being banned at all levels. And I think the Olympics is going to be really interesting in the next couple of rounds to see how they're going to deal with these athletes that don't neatly fit into these two categories.
So before we go on, I just want to mention, because I'm not sure if it came up, that Du, who you mentioned, who's one of the first athletes in the book, is a power lifter, actually.
Yes.
And I really appreciate the way that the book deals with the specificity of sport. Like, for example, there's a trans athlete who, takes medication and then finds that they have to widen their stance for basketball because their shoulders have broadened, or that Du is like crushing the girls' competition in this very specific sport, powerlifting. And I didn't realize that was how powerlifting was scored.
Totally.
So it's really it does seem to be the precision with which you write about sports is really helpful. And you are yourself an athlete. So can you just tell our listeners what sports you played?
Yeah. So I did everything as a kid. I just loved to play. I loved being in my body. I did tennis, gymnastics, and softball in high school. And then I competed in gymnastics and softball in college. And so this book was so fascinating because I had a really interesting cultural shift going from a college gymnastics culture to a college softball culture. Those two sports code a little bit different in terms of gender, and they highlight different parts of my physicality. So I was a very normal sized gymnast, and then I was a very small softball player, for example, right? And so I loved thinking about that and how different parts of my physicality were highlighted in those different sports. So when we're saying trans athletes can't compete in any of these, or that men always have an advantage over women, for example, and then we assume that trans women are men, it just becomes problematic right away because it depends. It depends on the sport, right? And I think gymnastics in particular was interesting because you look at a Simone Biles who's thriving in women's gymnastics, and that's not going to translate exactly the same way into men's gymnastics. And it's definitely not going to translate into other sports. So that's what I'm saying about really having nuanced, particular conversations that honor how complex our bodies are and how complex our different sports are and different types of strength and how we judge bodies in competition to say who showed up the best that day.
That's great. So that's so wonderful. Everything you're saying. So in June of last year, Kirsty Coventry, the president of the International Olympic Committee, indicated that it's possible that trans athletes could be banned from competing in the women's categories in the 2028 Olympics. The committee has also stated that it plans to reintroduce genetic sex testing as a way to verify the sex of all female Olympic athletes before they compete, which is a decision that's already faced a lot of backlash from sports advocacy and human rights organizations. Could you explain what genetic sex testing is and how it's harmful to athletes?
Yeah. So as long as we've had the female category, we've had folks policing the female category, and that has shifted over time. So at first, we would see nude parades where your sex was proven by your external sex traits. And so folks would be doing genital tests, and that is so invasive and makes the women's category really feel unsafe. Then we had a season of chromosomal passports where we would equate being female with what your chromosomes were. So you had to get your chromosomes tested ahead of time and then prove on this piece of paper that you were female. But we see so many chromosomal variants, right? That again, like our bodies are so cool. They're so varied. And so, and then, so we scientists will often use a two bucket system for sex because it's neater, it's cleaner, it's easier, but that doesn't mean it's right. Like scientists are starting to agree more and more that kind of a bimodal system where there's two camel humps instead of two static buckets is a better reflection of reality, which makes scientific testing extremely complicated. And it's hard to get good information about what makes someone female. Right? So we have chromosomes, we have hormone levels. Anyone going through perimenopause with peers in perimenopause knows how varied our hormones are body to body, right? So we're now in this period where we're equating the female category with levels of testosterone. Is like that's how we're deciding what is male and female. Testosterone is fascinating and complicated. Our levels of testosterone change during the day. It changes during our life. There's an overlap between cis men and cis women and their level of testosterone. And really, if we're going to be talking about competitive advantage, physical advantage in sport, where we're needing to talk about how the body uses testosterone, so testosterone receptors, and that's very hard to track. So we're doing things like we're hearing rumors about things like period tracking, or going back to these genital checks. And you have to know that the women who get pulled out to get tested to prove that they're women are the women who we deem as being disobedient to our idea of feminism, right? Our feminine ideal, rather, right? So I think about how if you look at me, there's some ways you could argue I have a fairly obedient looking body in terms of being feminine. But at the same time, when I was competing, I wasn't menstruating. So I would not have passed the menstruation check test that would deem me female, right? That I have coarse hair on my chin, which is a secondary sex trait, right? So it gets more and more complicated to figure out how we decide who fits in the female category. The more we learn about bodies, the more we're realizing that folks that have intersex variations and chromosomal variations and interesting hormone combinations in our bodies, it's trickier and trickier. And the people who lose out in this policing, more often than not, are women of color, right? And women of color that present as being muscular and strong and disobedient to what we think of as feminine, instead of being celebrated for being amazing athletes. So we have to ask who's going to be paying for this policing? How invasive is it? And why is it only the female category? And can we see that all girls and women are going to lose if this starts being instituted, right? Instead of just letting more bodies play.
And as you write in the book, I mean, I think so much of the public conversation around this really has centered around Caster Semenya, who,
Yes. Yes.
like
Yes.
just watching the experience of Caster Semenya as just scrutinized, like to have your
So
body
painful.
examined in this way, right? Which of
So
course also
painful.
speaks to the histories of the ways that Black and brown bodies have been scrutinized
Yes.
by the state or other people positioning themselves as authorities, whether those are institutional or corporate or something else.
That's right.
It was just horrifying.
Yes. Yes.
So, and yeah, like I think that this all right is affecting not only trans athletes but also the conversation about gender for all of us. And so you have in the book described really effectively how these policies are made under the guise of protecting cis women like myself, but in reality end up harming them as well. You have this line that really stuck with me that describes the fate of cis women and trans women as intertwined, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Absolutely. I We know, so research is showing that states that are more trans friendly and trans inclusive, not only are more girls and women participating, they're also reporting having better experience. So there's something about this idea that cis women need to be protected from trans women that takes away our dignity. I don't want to divest from that. I don't need cis men protecting me from trans women. I'm powerful beyond measure. I'm not fragile. I want to compete against trans women, and I can handle that. And I can very clearly see in our sex segregated sports world, there's so much work to do to bring more equity into the women's sports system that I don't want to be distracted thinking that trans women are the problem. They are not, they're decidedly not the problem. And if I can work together with trans women, if cis women and trans women can come together and all women can fight for equity in the sports system, I think everybody wins. Because cis boys and cis men are losing here too by saying that the worst thing for you to be is a woman, and that the worst thing to have happen would be for a man to have to compete against a woman. You know, like I should take offense at all of these pieces of logic. I definitely want sports to become safer, and I definitely want to think about fairness. The conversation with that is so much more interesting than just saying that trans athletes are the problem. And so, you know, there's all of these ways that the system will come in and try to separate people so that we won't come together to fight like hell. And in this case, I see the system coming in trying to separate cis women from trans women, so we don't come together and fight like hell for more equity in sports systems. We just got great news about the WNBA, right? And that they're starting to get paid what they deserve to get paid. Like these are the big wins where we're talking about feminist coaching, and we're talking about pay, and we're talking about opportunity, and we're talking about media time. Any energy I put toward thinking that trans women are the problem is energy I'm not putting toward actually working toward the equity that we deserve.
I just want to mention really quickly because you're making me think of so many other episodes we've done in the past.
Oh,
We did
cool.
an episode, we've done a lot of episodes where I think one of the things I've noticed is the ways that the conversation tilts towards talking about trans women. And like part of that is because of the intense misogyny that is swamping this conversation. And then we also had the wonderful writer Max Delson who came on and talked about issues facing trans men. And then also your comment about like kind of menstruation policing reminds me of we had Gary Steingart on for an episode where
Cool.
in a speculative novel that he wrote, there's a child who is like crossing state borders and gets to a state boundary and is asked, you know, the child is not that old, and has to face a kind of menstruation interrogation. So I don't know. Like I wish, and I remember it sort of being at the time like, I wish that this seemed more speculative, Gary, because
Right?
it didn't seem that distant.
We're there. We're there. Absolutely. Oh, that's fascinating. Mm.
Yeah, so it is. So, I mean, you mentioned in the book that trans athletes, and more specifically trans women, are
Yeah.
often discriminated against in part because their participation is deemed as unfair
Yeah.
to cisgender athletes due to the perception that they have a potential physiological advantage. However, you also bring up a really fascinating point about how racial and socioeconomic privileges play a much larger role in determining an athlete's ability to compete at a certain level. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Absolutely. So we do have to be really careful when we're talking about advantage. There's
Mhm.
physiological advantage and then there's competitive advantage. The
Mhm.
physiological advantage conversation is much more interesting than we think. And the problem is that we have studied cis male bodies. That's what we
Mhm.
have science on. We don't have good data on the female bodies yet, and we don't have good data on trans bodies.
Right.
And so when we're trying to look to science to inform these policies, it's just not there yet. It's not
Mhm.
there yet. But we do know that there's not a direct correlation between levels of testosterone in a body and physiological performance. We want those two things to equate, and that is not what the data is showing us. But I think a more interesting conversation to be had when we're talking about fairness, that's the number one question I get asked. Well, is it fair? And when they're
Mhm.
saying, is it fair? What they're asking, is it fair for a trans woman to compete against a cis woman? It only is going one way. So just like you said,
Right.
Sugi, like trans men are being completely disappeared in this conversation, which is a huge problem, right? So like, let's talk about what we're really talking about. Do you think that it's fair for a trans woman to compete against a cis woman? What's implied in that is you think a trans woman is biologically a male, and that's not what's happening, right? And so we need to learn more about gender affirming healthcare, and more about different types of strength and what types of strength get highlighted in which sports, right? That there's huge psychological consequences for being a trans person navigating a cis system. Right. And then we have to talk about not just physiological advantage, but also competitive advantage. Who is winning is who has always won. It's people who tend to have two stable parents and enough income to support that child not working, right? And having access to excellent coaches and excellent facilities and then the time to train. So you think about a Michael Phelps or Simone Biles, these athletes that we love how dominant they are. And you could list out a bunch of their physiological advantages that make them great at their sport. I would argue some of those that you could list have to do with like also their mental health, right? Their emotional health, their stability at home, their financial stability. And I'm going to put that they're cisgendered on their list of advantages because there's an ease of body for them navigating a cis sports world that we didn't hear from when we interviewed the trans athletes, right? That they were vigilant, that they were constantly looking out for their physical safety, that there was something about them that felt dangerous, that they couldn't quite find the words for, right? And that's a distraction from their ability to compete, just like with ease in alignment. And then you look at a Michael Phelps and a Simone Biles, not only did they have the physiological advantages to excel at their particular sports, but they also had those competitive advantages. They could financially afford to go to the best facilities and get the best coaching, right? And train and train and train to become the best at their sport. And so if we're going to talk about fairness in sports, I think it's much more interesting to talk about money. And if we're going to talk about money, then we get to talk about race. But we don't want to talk about capitalism, right? So if we were to make sports more fair, the fastest way to get there, I'm going to argue, would be to make youth sports free. Give every kid equal access to great facilities, no entry fee, and see what happens. And I'm saying this as a gymnast. I chose a sport that was very expensive. And at the time that I was competing, it was also very white. And those two things were connected, right? So I do think that focusing on trans folks as like the laser point focus of the fairness conversation is a dodge. It's a distraction. And we have to talk about money and how capitalism is playing into youth sports. And I would argue stealing some of the exuberance and fun.
That's great. Thank you.
It's a little bit like, I don't know, starting a war with Iran to distract people from the Epstein files.
Right.
Very similar. Very similar.
We're in the age of distraction.
That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, this is all, it would be great if youth sports were free. They are so expensive, right? It's like, it is, like your kid puts on football pads and you're like, oh my God. And now you need like all of the protective gear and the cleats and I don't know, like it's just, as a person whose kids are playing a lot of sports, I'm always like, wow.
And who's losing out there? Like who's not getting the opportunity to even try, right? Like to me, that's more interesting when we talk about fairness. Yeah.
Yeah. And as some of our listeners know, like I have these chronic hand injuries. So I go to PT 2 to 3 times a week. And I go to the place that treats like the Vikings, and because my insurance covers it because I'm a privileged person. And there are all of these young elite athletes in there, and just like the stuff that they have access to, their rehab, their treatment, or even just like the flat out, just the coaching. It's wild.
It's wild.
And it is, so much about wealth. So you've spoken and written so effectively about this. And so one of the great things about the book for our listeners is that, right, Ellie and their co-author, Allie Baeth, have interviewed these 20 athletes. And you note about how like there's all of this coverage of this issue of trans athletes, but their voices are so rarely represented. And so in the book, you interview these 20 athletes, and you started the project in 2023. By the time you wrapped it up, only 5 of the athletes you had spoken to were still eligible legally to compete in sports. I was like, what? And so that's going on. And when you're talking about like the privilege of cis folks in ease of body, there's also, of course, like the ease of mind of, I don't know, having determined one's identity. And then also like the bureaucratic maze that folks are having to navigate to be like, am I allowed to compete? In which category do I compete? Is someone going to try to stop me from competing? Like, how will people's positions shift so I feel supported or not supported? So you talk about the proliferation of policy and all of its variations across states and its disproportionality in relation to the actual number of trans athletes. And here I'm really talking about, I suppose, like K through 12 and then maybe also college. And that this can have a negative effect on cisgender youth as well. So can you talk a little bit about, like, we've been talking about elite competition. Can we talk a little bit about like the kids and how this is hard for them?
That's right. I mean, most of us aren't going to the Olympics, right? We don't want to believe it, but most of us are not going to the Olympics. So the vast majority of the people that we're talking about are the kids, youth, and adults who want to play pickup soccer on a Monday night, right? And these bans are starting to affect those folks too, where stakes are so low. And so I think we need to talk about what the short wins are versus what the infinite wins are. And, what for kids and youth, youth sport was invented as a developmental program. So what are we trying to develop in our children? Like, what would we like to see that's already inside of them? Like, take up more space and come alive because they're on a team. I'm frankly getting less and less interested in talking to anyone who's not willing to start with the suicide rate of trans kids. That's what this book is about. Like, we can talk about trans women sprinting in the Olympics, but to me, what this is about is that we see all sorts of benefits for kids having a sense of belonging. And if a kid has a sense of belonging on a sports team, how dare we take that opportunity away, right? And in this decidedly cis society that we're living in, where it becomes more and more dangerous to come out as trans, it's the trans kids who need those opportunities more and more to feel like they're in a group where they belong, which is, I think, a body feel. Your vigilance can drop and you can start breathing in your diaphragm and you don't have to protect your physical safety. It's like, if we can create teams for trans kids to have that sense of belonging, why wouldn't we do that? Right. And then let's have all those other conversations later. But it's like, that is where I want to start the conversation. Is suicide rates are higher in trans kids and trans youth. And so they deserve our attention and our creativity for how to build belonging and how to build embodiment. The other thing I get really fired up about is, like, our society we need more play. We need more exuberance. We need more joy. We need more embodiment. Sport is one way to get that. And as a former girl who coached girls, I do see sport as a really beautiful corrective to a society that tells girls to play small and to be docile and to not be competitive and to not have agency in their bodies. And so I think, for the kids who feel particularly vulnerable, it really hurts when I see that we're removing opportunities for them to be in their bodies, to play, to belong. And it's a pathway into our bodies where then we can figure out who we are. We can become the best knowers of ourselves. And I think kids and youth need that. All of the research that's showing that sports can be really beneficial, not only for our bodies of children, but for mental health, right? Emotional health, stability, regulation. I just don't think we can mess with that. And right now, there are a bunch of trans kids who aren't allowed to play their sport. And like, who wins in that situation? And how can it possibly matter? Whether we think that that's fair or not, I don't know.
Yeah, you had this line where you said trans kids are asking for free will to make choices about who they are. And I just circled around that over and over again. I was just like, oh my Lord. So could you expand on that just a little bit for
Yeah.
our listeners?
Yeah, when I used to teach like gender, sex, sexuality, dating, and one of my taglines for these young folks as they're trying things on is like to only use a label if it sets you free, and so I just
Mm.
saw these kids trying on labels and kind of then checking in with their bodies, like, does that label feel constricting or does it feel expansive? And I think I get more excited talking about some of these things, even at my age, as being dynamic, right? Moving, not static, trying things on, moving toward a sense of expansion. And so when we interviewed these kids, they were telling the adults in their lives, this is who I am. And the only thing that they were being asked is for us to believe them. Right. And I think that
Mm.
that came out in the stories of the trans adults as well, is like
Mm.
they just wanted to be believed. And I have those body stories as a woman of having people not believe me when I said that I was in pain, or not believe me when I said somebody did something to my body that didn't feel right. And that again is like, I am deeply invested in sports becoming safer. Trans athletes are not the problem. Right. And so, like in
Mm.
my case, it's like, as a gymnast, I want to make sure we're talking about Larry Nassar as the person who's doing harm, not trans women. Right. Like, who is actually doing harm in the locker room? Let's talk about that, because these girls who said this didn't feel right, they didn't get believed. So there's an entry point for connection. It's like, these girls deserved to be believed. So do the trans kids when they say, hey, this thing that I was assigned at birth, it doesn't fit. And I don't quite get it. But like we just heard over and over again in the book where we said, explain to us what it feels like in your body to be trans. Like they articulated so beautifully what it feels like with that moment of alignment, right? Where the label that got assigned to them didn't quite fit. It was misaligned. There was a lot of white noise. There was a rub. There was friction. And then when they realized, oh, I think I'm trans, da-dunk, right? It fit. And I
Mm.
think that's another point where it's like, sometimes I've had friends talk about getting a diagnosis. That's extremely helpful. It's liberating. It's like, that helps. There's more information, and there's that alignment that moves us toward that liberatory bodily freedom. And I just think when anyone's brave enough to tell us who they are, it's our job to just start by believing them and go from there. Right.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So, you tell the story of a young trans girl, M, who is fortunately, based
Yeah.
on laws of her state, able to compete on her high school softball and volleyball teams. It's really touching because even though she still faces backlash, she also receives a lot of support from her community. Advocacy seems to be an important part of her story, and M advocates for herself, though her openness and her determination to be the best athlete she can be. Her mother, coaches, and teammates are all advocates for her as well. So I was wondering if you could touch on how we can advocate for trans athletes, especially considering it's a state by state issue.
Yeah. It was so fascinating, especially interviewing the youth who live in different states who had such varied experience depending on the state that they were living in. And so I do think there's work to be done at okay, at the body level, right? So I did a lot of work on my body, like coming out as cis, having an active cis identity, so that, hearing folks have to navigate the world as trans people, I did the work of becoming more aware of the water I'm swimming in as a cis person. That helped me then show up at these conversations with a calm nervous system, but also like a creative mind of where we could go together. So I think
Mm.
how we talk to our kids and other people about our bodies and about our identities being a little bit more dynamic and alive and breathing, I think that matters, right? Like how we talk to our young people about the infinite wins, like what is an actual win versus winning a singular game, right? Like, what are we up to? Can sports be fun? Can we reclaim that joy, that exuberance, that embodiment? That's what it started out to be about. And then I think that at the interpersonal level, so it's like there's work I can do with my body, there's work I can do with the people in my life of how I talk about it. But then yes, there's plenty to do at the institutional levels, especially for kids, like talking to athletic directors, coaches, teammates, parents, and in M's case, it was like talking to the principal of the opposing school, talking to the athletic director, talking to the coach, right? Being like, let's step up and have a better experience for all of our kids. And showing these kids that adults, can carve out space for them to play, and to develop this like really cool thing when we have proximity to people that the society doesn't want us to have proximity to. There is a big win. But then, yeah, at the systemic level as well. So beyond the institutions in our life, like what can we do in terms of policy, for healthcare? Whose bodies are on the policy table and whose bodies are not? How can we advocate for the most vulnerable bodies in our society so that it gets safer for more and more people? But yeah, so I think that there's just so much that we can do at all four of those levels. Sometimes we jump to systems and forget that we can do stuff in our own bodies and it right face to face with the people in our lives that make a huge difference. So I'm thinking about Robin as another youth who couldn't play sports in her state, and her teacher started an unofficial running club, as a loophole, right? So that Robin still had a place to move and play with her peers, and she got away with that because it wasn't an official sport, right? So I think about this book is full of really inspiring stories of cis people who are working the system to keep creating those spaces, so that more kids can play, right?
That's great. And there's also, right, there's an appendix. Actually, there's like a few appendixes, and Appendix B has just gonna 10 better questions cis folks can ask each other. So
Yeah.
some of those are addressing some of the things that you were talking about, like identifying ourselves as cis. Like, what does it mean to have that identity? What does it bring us? How does it limit us? And
Yeah.
yeah, I think that yeah, it's helpful to kind of hear these stories of people yeah, thinking a little subversively about how to approach these structures that are failing us.
They are. Yeah, we're all losing for sure. It takes our dignity away. And I think like we're getting a little further thinking about like whiteness is the problem of racism, right? Like toxic whiteness. There's we don't talk as much about cisness and like internalized misogyny, right? And like transphobia being the problem here. And so I think there's just plenty of, instead of giving in to the fact that that trans athletes are the problem, spinning that lens and being like, what can I do as a cis person to become more awake and alive in my own body, and then see how the systems is not serving any of us right now.
This is so fascinating. It's like, so I used to be a higher education reporter, and higher education has now more women than men. That's been true for some years, and more women than men in most forms of graduate school. And like, big shock that now suddenly the country's turning anti-intellectual, and so are many of our politicians. Like, oh, what a great time to attack these spaces that are full of women. Now that women and people of color and like all sorts of folks who were previously marginalized are getting more access to these spaces. Now we don't want them to exist. And then
Yes.
also, I've been really troubled by the ways that higher education, right, like as Trump has been attacking universities, some of the things that they have asked, for example, like university healthcare systems to do, like, and Brown, I think, was like one of the places that was like in the agreement, like, will gender affirming care be available through your health system or on your campus? And it's like one of the things that's being attacked and then given up. Like, oh, this is a thing I'll negotiate on. Like, this is a way that I'll keep my campus safe. But actually, you haven't kept your campus safe or your community safe
Yeah,
because you're denying healthcare to people who need it.
that's right. That's right.
And all of this is also contributing. I mean, I think it's important to think about the belonging,
Yeah,
and then also the opposite of that is isolation.
that's right.
Which, like, when you are thinking about the
That's right.
suicide rates, I think back to the conversation we had with like Brooklyn Public Librarian about who was affected by book bans, and it's like the same set of people.
Yes.
So
Yes. Yes. Mm.
um,
Mm. Mhm.
anyway, they're just getting
Yes.
crabbier and crabbier. But your book emphasizes joy, which I'm so grateful
That's
for.
right. That's
So one
right.
common theme among the athlete stories in your book is the joy, as you've been saying, that sports allows them to feel in their bodies. And the
That's
athletes
right.
all have different ways of describing that joy. But Addison, another power
Oh.
lifter, I'm really going to have to
Oof.
try this. Someday when
Oof.
my hand injuries aren't so brutal, I will be powerlifting, and it
Yes.
will be thanks to this book. Could you read a little bit from
Yes.
Addison's section where
Oh,
described so beautifully?
yes. Yeah, I really think trans athletes have the opportunity to lead us all into this future that has more embodied joy. Here we go. Powerlifting competitions can be intimidating. You are in front of a crowd and you try to lift as much weight as you can once. It's a pass or fail event. Before Addison walked out for her first competitive lift, she turned her focus inward and took deep breaths. The room was loud, but all she could hear was the voice in her head. In front of the crowd, she set her feet and focused her gaze above the heads in the crowd. Everything became quiet, and she did what she came to do. Quote, as soon as I go to initiate that pull, every single muscle in my body is tense and active. And that feeling is so addicting. When people are like, oh, you were born in the wrong body, it's like, no, the fuck, I wasn't. Look at what this body has done for me. Look at what I can do with this body. I refuse to allow myself to be limited by this idea of my body needs to change in order for it to be authentic. Absolutely not. I give the middle finger to that narrative. This body can do incredible things. This culture is the problem. My body is limitless. Addison's coach pulled her aside after her first competitive lift and said, I could see you going to that place of just you and the platform. Make sure you don't forget how to do that. That's going to be very important. Addison broke her goal of deadlifting 300 pounds. Her new goal is 350, which will be double her body weight. In powerlifting, Addison has found community. In between lifts, she loves to hang out with the other lifters and eat junk food, pumping each other up. Like the dive bar, it has become a place that feels like home, like safety, where she belongs, just as she is. Addison lifts for herself. It's not about winning or beating other people. It is about seeing what her body can do and crushing her goals. It's about not being afraid to walk into a weight room, taking up space. In the weight room, she never needs to defend her existence.
Great. It's wonderful.
Love it.
Thank you so much. So that was wonderful. So in the afterword of your book, you mentioned that you identify as a cisgender woman,
Yeah.
but due to certain educational experiences and relationships, you felt a really strong call to allyship and advocacy, and it led you to the writing of this book. So can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. Well, the first part is it tends to be unexpected for people, but I was raised by like really fiery feminist nuns. And they taught me when a policy came down that you were supposed to look to the most vulnerable people in society and say, how is this policy going to affect them? Okay. So then fast forward, I'm teaching in a high school and I meet Mark, who ends up being my first trans student. And at that time, his parents weren't very supportive of his transition. And I became one of the adults in his life that would just advocate for him, believe him, right? Walk with him through this journey. And I ended up having other trans students who came out to me either during high school or years afterwards, and watching them in the context of high school, they were vulnerable, right? That it was still pretty scary to come out and say, I'm trans. And so then if you fast forward more, and I'm seeing all these bans coming down saying trans athletes are the problem, that policy is like, how is that going to affect the most vulnerable people? And trans folks are some of the most vulnerable people in society, right? We see the suicide rates higher. We see the murder rates, especially trans women of color, are so high. They are not coming in droves to steal your medals. They need advocacy and support to be able to navigate our society and feel a little bit more safe, right? And so I knew I had work to do. And as a former athlete, I thought, well, this is going to be really interesting to be able to sit at the feet of these trans athletes and say, tell me the longest version you've got. So we're seeing that less than 2% of the articles that are about trans athletes actually quote them. And so at the very least, Fair Game is just trying to allow trans athletes to tell their version of the story so that when we see these bans coming through, we know that we're talking about real people. And these real people are not the monsters that the media wants to make them out as. They're actually folks who need our support and like who will make society better, right? So it's like including them is not just the nice thing to do. It's like their joy, Addison's joy, is going to lead us into a more beautiful future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Ellie, we really appreciate you being here with us today.
Yeah.
And listeners, we want to make sure that you pick up a copy of Fair Game at an independent bookstore near you.
Thank you.